Hello everybody and welcome back, and as you can see from the title, we're going to look at how to take these program learning outcomes that we wrote in our last session and how do we make sure that the program learning outcomes map onto the module learning outcomes, and also that if we've written program learning outcomes for a level 8 degree, then it is level 8, it is an honours degree, it's not a pass degree or a diploma level. So let's get started. Supposing you're starting with a blank page and you're designing a new program. The first thing you need to do is to identify the program learning outcomes. In other words, what will graduates of this program be able to do when they finish the program? The second thing then is you have to take modules in such a way that all the program learning outcomes that you've made out are covered in one or more of those modules. In other words, that they're reflected in the module learning outcomes. Thirdly, then you'll have to assign credits to each module. We'll be talking about ECTS credits in a further video in this series. And then you have to design teaching, learning and assessment strategies for each module for filling in the module descriptions. That's fairly straightforward. You also then have to check, before you sign off on the program, that constructive alignment exists. In other words, that the learning outcomes, the teaching learning activities and the assessment, that they're all coordinated. And again, in one of the future talks in this series, I'll show you how to do that. And if constructive alignment doesn't exist, then you have to go back to adjust the program learning outcomes again and go through the whole procedure. So it's a very important process, and that's the top-down approach for a brand new program. If you're, say, looking at a program that's already up and running and you want to maybe give it a refresh or make some changes in it, then it'll be the bottom-up approach. That, in other words, you'll be working from the modules and module descriptors as they exist already, working up to make sure that all of those 5 stages are completed in terms of the program design. So all programs that we now teach are designed within the Bologna process, what's often referred to as a learning outcomes framework. And there are 2 things that you need to check in your role as a program director or program coordinator or head of department. And that is, do the program learning outcomes map onto the module learning outcomes? In other words, each of the program learning outcomes that you wrote must be reflected in at least one module in the program. And secondly then, you have to make sure that the program learning outcomes map on to the relevant level of the National Qualifications framework. We'll have a look at that in a moment. So the first thing is relatively straightforward, the mapping of program learning outcomes onto the module learning outcomes. And I suggest the easiest way to do that is like the grid that you see there on the screen. And as you can see, along the top here, we list out each program. Supposing in this program, now there are 8 program learning outcomes. Remember, the maximum is 10. And down here, we have the various modules in the program. So let's look at an example to put flesh on this. This was a program that landed on my desk in my role as an external examiner for this university. And I was asked to have a look at it. And I was very impressed with the paperwork. The program director did a superb job. It wasn't belonging to this university. It was another university, but the program director clearly had done his homework. So here we have the program learning outcomes 1, 2, 3 and 4. And 5, 6, 7 and 8. So each of those were clearly written. written according to the rules, and each program learning outcome was actually numbered to help make my job that bit easier. Now, what did the program director do? He listed out the program learning outcomes along the top here. And then in this grid, he listed out all the various modules. This is an MSc program. Okay, so down here we have all the program modules, each program module having its own learning outcomes. And he then indicated where each of the program learning outcomes was covered in a particular module. So for example, program learning outcome 3 is involved with developing laboratory skills in these master students. And that was covered, as you can see, there's an X there, it was covered in the toxicology module, and they also covered laboratory skills in their project. So that program learning outcome was covered in 2 modules, and as you can see, every other learning outcome was covered in some module down along the list. So the mapping exercise was very clearly presented there, and it saves the external examiner a lot of work having to go through a lot of paperwork when it's summarized on a table. So I would certainly recommend that sort of table to you. So it's important that you make this clarity, that you make sure that you have this level of clarity in your paperwork, particularly if you're submitting it for program accreditation by an external body. The second thing then is you have to check, do the program learning outcomes that you've written for the bachelor's, master's or PhD program, do they map on to the relevant level of the National Qualifications framework that we have here in Ireland? Now, it's level 8, as you're aware, probably for honours degrees and higher diplomas, level 9 for masters. Those would be the 2 main ones. And the National Qualifications framework in Ireland, I'm afraid it's not very user-friendly, and I'll explain that in a moment, because of the fact that we were the first country in Europe to develop our National Qualifications framework. Now, unfortunately, it used this word competences. Now, I'll be explaining in a separate talk what competences are and why they're such a vague concept to use. Now, this is our National Qualifications framework in Ireland. As you can see, level 8, honours bachelor's and higher diploma, level 9, our master's and postgraduate diploma, and level 10, doctorate or higher doctorate degrees. So, the rest of them need not concern us in this talk, but as you can see, it goes right down to leaving certificate and to junior cycle level. Now, this was developed in 2003. Remember, Bologna was only in 1999. So our framework was developed in a very fast manner, perhaps too fast, as we should see. And so this framework is, that's the definition of the National Qualification Framework. So all learning achievements are mapped on to this framework. And each country has its own framework. But for all of those countries that have signed up to Bologna, they must map on to the European Qualifications Framework. There are 10 levels in Ireland. As we see, this isn't the same number as there is in the European Qualifications Framework. And they have substrands of knowledge, skills, and competences is really performance in the workplace. So this is the entire framework of qualifications. I know it's too small, you can't read it on the screen. But as you can see, there's 8 of these subsections. Now, if I just zoom in on the ones that interest us in levels 8, 9, and 10, you can see here they have 4 in terms of knowledge. And it's important to remember that these general statements are what are called generic descriptors. They are designed to apply to every level 8 degree in every subject in every third level institution. So by definition, they have to be quite vague and all embracing. So the mapping of your program learning outcomes from your level 8 degree onto these is not difficult because of the fact that these are so broadly based anyway. So they have 4 in terms of knowledge and know-how and skill. And they have 4 in terms of these competences, which are very vague statements. And hopefully they will be updated in due course. Now, the Bologna process only dealt with third level, and the European Qualifications framework came out in 2008. This was after the Qualifications framework in Ireland. So in 2008, the European Qualifications framework was so impressed by Bologna that they said, right, okay, Bologna only applies to third level, but we're going to produce a framework that will apply to every level from kindergarten up to PhD. And that's exactly what they did. And generally, the European Qualifications framework, they did a very good job on it. Now, they had the experience of Bologna, so that in the European Qualifications framework, the bachelor level 6, the master's level 7, and the level 8 doctoral degrees, those generic descriptors that you see there are almost identical to what they had in Bologna. Now, when this framework came out first in 2008, they used knowledge, skills, and competence. But as time went on, they realized that with research in this area of competence, that it really wasn't a good word to use, because they interpreted competence as responsibility and autonomy. Competence is different from knowledge and skills. Unfortunately, in Ireland, competence is interpreted in terms of overlapping with knowledge and skills. But here, competence is entirely has to do with performance in the workplace. So when the European Qualifications Framework was updated in 2018, in celebration of its 10th anniversary, they still kept the knowledge and skills, because that's very clear, but they changed it to responsibility and autonomy. And that made it much more sort of user-friendly to interpret. And if we just zoom in on knowledge and skills, remember, it's level 6 for the European Qualifications Framework for a bachelor's. In Ireland, unfortunately, it's level 8, so we're a bit out of sync. It's level 7 for a master's and level 8 for a PhD in the European Qualifications Framework. And as you can see here, these are very generalized statements. As I mentioned earlier, they have to apply to every honours bachelor's degree in every subject, in every university, throughout the European higher education area, throughout all of the countries that have signed up to the Bologna process, and likewise with skills. And in terms of responsibility and autonomy, I just split our chart in 2 so that you could read some of them. Again, honours bachelor's, level 6, level 7 for masters, level 8 for doctoral. Again, you can see there, it's all about performance in the workplace. You might recall in the last talk, I spoke about Bloom's taxonomy. Knowledge, cognitive domain, skills, psychomotor domain, and responsibility, embracing values, the affective domain. So this is really the affective domain. And you might remember I mentioned in the last talk that when we were dealing with, say, training teachers, they could have the knowledge of the subject, they could have good teaching skills, but unless they can perform in the workplace and behave to professional standards, looking after children, being patient, being kind, showing empathy, then they can't function. So this really is the a third of the domains of Bloom, the effective domain, is what responsibility and autonomy is all about. And my former colleague, Dr. Norma Ryan, who was in charge of quality promotion unit here in UCC at one stage, she had this slide, and I asked her, could I use it? And I put her name on it to remind me to thank her. But here we have the European Qualifications Framework, and this is really like the translation device. And here we have various countries. So this could be Ireland, and we map our national qualifications framework onto each of these levels. Okay, and here you have some other country, maybe Spain or whatever, and they would map their national qualifications framework onto these levels. So it was a pity that the European Qualifications Framework wasn't out before Ireland went ahead with theirs, because most countries now who are joining this Bologna process, are just going up to level 8, as in the European Qualifications Framework. So what advice would I give you when you're doing this mapping exercise? The advice I would give you is to use a grid something like this. Here are the 8 headings in the National Qualifications Framework for Level 8. Look at your programme learning outcomes and look at keywords here which I've highlighted. So, understanding of theory concepts, detailed knowledge and understanding, specialised areas, the ability in planning and design, carrying out research, being able to act effectively under guidance, say in project work, for example. You know, the fact that they are able to manage their learning tasks, and the fact that they can work as part of a team. So forget about these words like competence insight and competence learn to learn. They're meaningless phrases. Okay, and just look at the keywords and then see in your program learning outcomes, where are you talking about understanding, where are you talking about knowledge and understanding, and so on. So if you were to take, say, the Masters, this would be the level 9, and if you were to take the 8 learning outcomes, you get something like this. And this shows when you're looking for accreditation from a professional body or from an external examiner, this shows that you know what you're talking about. This shows that the program learning outcomes that you've developed are indeed of master's level, because they map on to level 9 in the National Qualifications Framework of Ireland. So in summary, programs can be learning outcomes, they can be developed using a top-down approach if you're starting with a blank page, or if you're refreshing a program learning outcomes, you have to work from a bottom-up approach where you tidy up some of the module learning outcomes, maybe put in new modules, make changes, and then map them on to the program learning outcomes at the top. And these program learning outcomes must map on to 2 things, the module learning outcomes and the National Qualifications Framework. And it's a pity that this word competence is used in the National Qualifications Framework of Ireland. It's due for a refresh now after almost 20 years. So hopefully they'll get rid of that term and use the responsibility and autonomy term, or performance in the workplace, as with the European Qualifications Framework. So thank you for sticking with me until the last slide. Thank you for your kind attention. May God bless you all, and I hope you've learned something from this presentation. So we leave it at that. Thanks.